One of the things I've learned, which is really quite amazing, is this. God has a time and God has a timetable. I believe that very much. I struggled and suffered with my back for 27 years of agony and pain. Those of you who know my story, and so many of you, actually one young man as he walked in tonight, put his hand on my back and said, "How's your back doing?" I had a triple herniation, 2 metal rods from my middle of my back all the way into my tailbone, 8 screws bolting me in, with 2 major surgeries that have transpired. Last year, through an incredible experience, a man from Singapore, godly man, came and said God had spoken to him. I don't have the time to go into the story to tell you. But as he laid his hand on my back and prayed, and I'd been prayed for years and years and years, it was an incredible thing. Maybe I'll just give you a snippet of it. He said, God told me 2 things about you yesterday. Number one, that his anointing in your life in the years that is going to be greater than the years to come. I said, Dew, are you really speaking from your heart that God said this to you? He said, yes. I said, I would welcome it. He said, but then Ravi, he told me something I have no clue about. He said, tell Ravi, like the Apostle Paul, he'll have a thorn in the flesh, but I'll take care of him. 3, 4, 5. He said, lying in bed there, I said, Lord, I don't know what 3, 4, 5 means. He said, you tell Ravi, he'll know. He said, I'm here to tell you here in Atlanta as I'm visiting from Singapore, God wants me to tell you he's going to take care of you 3, 4, 5, and I haven't a clue what that means. I got the tears in my eyes. I said, Dew, from 1985, the pain in my back has been L3-4 and L4-5. I'd get up in the morning and didn't know if I could walk straight. The shooting pain in my back, sometimes I'd sit in my car and just cry. The agony. I don't want to get into medicines because I don't want to foul with my brain, and so I just live in the pain. A few days later, after Dew prayed for me, my travel associate and I were in another city. I got off security and I sat down on a chair and bent my knee and bent down like this to tie my shoelace. He looked at me and said, what are you doing? I said, Corinne, I wasn't aware of what I'm doing. Because I'll tell you what, prior to that prayer, 29th May last year, if I'd done this and tied my shoelace, I'd be walking in pain for 6 to 7 weeks with anti-inflammatories because it would yank something in my back and I would just be hobbling over just to do this. I couldn't tie my shoelace without kneeling on the floor. I just looked at him and said, this is amazing. Absolutely amazing. I'd already told my wife what had happened on the prayer. Since 29th of May till today, I have not had that pain in my back. After 27 years, that pain is gone. You know, God has his time. He has his miracle. And I know I'm racing, so let me read this for you, and I'll move to my final thought. Please bear with me. I'll move to my final thought after this. Last June, after I met Hayden that night, this June, I guess. Yeah, this June, after I met Hayden in Manila. Prayed with him that night. I went straight on to Malaysia. I was preaching Kuala Lumpur the next day. And somebody in Malaysia, Manila, had asked if I would stay over. This is one of the largest churches in the country. Please stay on and preach till Sunday. I said, no, I've really been asked to go to Kuala Lumpur. I promised I would come. So I've got to go there. And I kept my word to come there, come to Kuala Lumpur and preach. And the letter came to me on June 11th of this year. Dear Dr. Zacharias, I'll try to keep this email short as I'm sure you receive hundreds if not thousands of similar emails from individuals touched by your messages. I would like to just thank you personally for what you've done for me. We met 3 Sundays ago at DMC Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I said to you, Dr. Zacharias, thank you for your message last night. I was almost ready to leave it all behind, leave my Christian life behind. But I stopped myself after hearing your message. Here is my story. The night before we met, Saturday 26 May 2013, I'd planned to go out with 2 close friends of mine on a drinking and binging night. The night out would be of the tail end of how 3 of us had recently become single men. Our individual relationships with the women we dated for 2 years had abruptly ended a few weeks ago. The 3 of us had made a deal to go out that very night with a few objectives, one of which was to meet women, the other was to spend lots of money, and to even go to places where beautiful women would be catered as drinking partners. Forgive me, it sounds quite sleazy, We had not actually ever done this before, but we were that frustrated. We would not even have known how the night would have ended, but I was determined to forget what I'd gone through, the hurt, the pain, the powerlessness, the rejection. I can't explain in detail what we planned to do that night, but enough to say the road I was prepared to walk on would have been an immensely hedonistic one from which it would have probably been difficult to return. And because I work in the television industry, drinking and partying nights were not uncommon. But what was distinct about last Saturday night was that I made a conscious decision in my heart that the night's entertainment would know no Christian boundaries. That was the key difference. You see, Dr. Zacharias, I was prepared to compromise every rule that I had held to as a latecomer to Christ at 27 years of age. No, I'm not being melodramatic, but I'd become a Christian 9 years ago, and in the spirit I've seen the worst of organized Christian religion. I would prefer not to go into too much detail of why I feel this way. But I've gone through the highs and lows of a Christian journey, from times of lofty accomplishments in the church, even being slated for leadership, going to Borneo on a mission trip, to the lows of falling out with church members, which resulted in me giving up, walking out, and becoming an outcast even at church. A forgotten individual lost amidst a sea of people. I came to DMC on that Saturday night after about 6 months of not going to church, going in and out of cell groups, but not really feeling I belonged to this, what I considered a cult-like group. All that changed when in your message you reminded me of who God is, the one with Jehoshaphat's prayer of 2 Chronicles 20. I hung on to every word that night, especially when you spoke about the father who saved his son from the waterfall and God riding the subway. My own testimony was like the subway story, but I'll save it for another time. It is amazing that just this understanding is enough for me to rethink who God is to me. A personal God who cares for our every step, and it serves as a reminder that He's the reason I started out on this journey in the first place. I don't know how much I've heard that night was due to my emotions, but I did distinctly hear you say you were not really supposed to come to Malaysia, but the Philippines wanted you to stay back and was expecting you, but you could not ignore the fact that God had spoken to you to come here to preach your message. As skeptical as I am, I'm humbled that God thought me of worth enough to send my favorite Christian apologist and author to speak to me and nobody. Thank you, Dr. Zacharias, from the bottom of my heart. That weekend indeed was unforgettable because we both follow and serve a great God. Once again, I thank God for you. Unknown to you, you saved my life by stopping over in Malaysia that weekend. Please remember that whatever inconvenience you'd faced in that brief stop is greatly treasured and not wasted at all. My best regards to you. Anil said it right. You're not here by accident. Do you have something to do with in your life to deal with God? Have you lost touch with your own message? Has the enemy of our souls got you trapped in something you never wanted to be in? I earnestly suggest to you, you can be running and running and running, and the hound of heaven is on your trail because he loves you and wants you back for what he has made you. You know, I've often said to people, I was a 17-year-old good-for-nothing, the only one of us 5 kids who was a total failure. Total failure. And yet when I was in a hospital room dying, God found it fit to send somebody to my hospital bed to give me a Bible. It was given to me by Fred David. Many of you will know who he was. He was the Delhi director for Youth for Christ. He passed away in February of this year. Before he died in California, he was with his daughter living in a little trailer home all by himself. I phoned him and he said to me, Rav, I'm getting ready to die. And I just keep watching your messages on YouTube and so on, and I say to myself, is this why God brought me into the world, to take a Bible to give to you when you were 17? God has a mission for you and me. He has a mission. You will never know whose life you're touching when you're sensitive to God. He came to me, on whom everybody had given up. Here's a time and a place. If you're running, stop running. He wants you back. Out of touch with his surroundings, out of touch with his message. The only thing he was in touch is with his own comfort. And I close with this illustration. Andrew, so good to have you here. Your brother Stuart is a soulmate to me. He has done more for me than I can ever gainsay. He and Mary are such a blessing. And years ago, I was in your beloved country of Scotland. I was visiting the home of David Livingstone in Blantyre. David Livingstone was born in Blantyre, Scotland in 1813. He was a genius, reading Latin at the age of 10, mastering the languages. And as a youngster, he got on his knees and he prayed this: send me anywhere, only go with me. Lay any burden on me, only sustain me. Sever any ties but the ties that bind me to your service and to your heart. He said, through it all the words of Christ came to me, lo, I'm with you always, even unto the end of the age. He went to Africa and he wrote in his journal, the haunting spectre of the smoke of 1,000 villages in the morning sun has burned within my heart. And he started to give his life to Africa. His wife, Mary Moffat, the daughter of the famed Moffat family, couldn't handle the African diseases that she could not get any immunity to, and she suffered and suffered and suffered. Finally, she said, David, I don't want to die here yet. I'll stand with you, let me go back home. So he sent her back to England. And she said, you keep doing what you're doing, I'll raise the money for you. Keep doing what you're doing. She went back home. It was not 1 year, not 2 years, not 3 years, not 4. I think it was about 5 before they saw each other again. Can you imagine that? I couldn't do it. He goes back. She couldn't recognize him. His skin was burnt to a crisp and leather by the torrid African sun. He'd walked into the branch of a tree, blinded in one eye. A lion had attacked him, torn one of his shoulders. He hobbled, but like a hero in Britain, everybody wanted to hear what he had to say. Finally he said, Mary, the haunting spectre of the smoke of 1,000 villages in the morning sun is still burning within my heart. She said, David, you go back. You go back. I'll follow you. He went back. Long time later she came. The day she set foot on African soil, she contracted a dreadful disease. Not long after that, he was burying her. And eyewitnesses said they heard him kneel in prayer by her grave. He said, my Jesus, my King, my life, my all, I again consecrate my life to thee. I shall place no value in anything I do or anything I possess, except in relation to thy kingdom and to thy service. He said, through it all the words of Christ came to me, lo, I'm with you always, even unto the end of the age. He went from village to village. His body became so sick, he had no medication, and that's where the famed Henry M. Stanley story comes in, who wrote the 2-volume biography, Livingstone of Africa. Finally, one day he told his 2 African brothers, he said, brethren, take me to my hut. I don't think I can carry on anymore today. And as they were rolling him into bed, he said, no, help me on my knees. They said, you really need to get to sleep. He said, help me on my knees and wait a moment or two and then help me back. And he got on his knees and they stood outside because his prayer sanctuary was so private. They kept looking and looking. He was always so long on his knees. They finally went towards him to ask him if they could put him into bed. When they tapped him on the shoulder, he rolled over, he fell over, he was dead. He died on his knees. Just the way he always wanted to live, in the presence of God. You know, the 2 African men put his body on a stretcher and traveled for 1,500 miles, mainly by foot, so that he could be buried back in his homeland. But they took his heart and buried it in Africa. Today, if you go to Westminster Abbey, you'll see the plaque or the stone for David Livingstone. Out of touch with your message, out of touch with your surroundings, in touch with your comforts? No. It has to be changed. Get in touch with your surroundings. Understand it. Get in touch with your message. Be in love with it. The power to transform lives. Get out of touch with your own comfort. Send me anywhere, only go with me. Lay any burden on me, only sustain me.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. We're grateful for your prayers and financial support. If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at www.rzim.org. You can also stay connected to RZIM through Twitter and Facebook. Our mailing address is RZIM, Post Office Box 921939, Norcross, Georgia, 30010.
My honor to be with you here at Princeton. When I was in Germany.
India, very close to Bangladesh.
George Washington University.
The Middle East.
Meetings in Angola prison.
United States.
From China.
In Canada.
In the United Kingdom.
In Istanbul, in Ankara, and Izmir.
Romania.
At American University.
In the University of Harvard. Manila in the Philippines.
Perth, Australia.
To South Africa.
In Africa.
To Malaysia, to Indonesia, to Singapore. The mission of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries is really to reach the thinker and the skeptic, to answer the questions, and do evangelism undergirded by apologetics, in clearing all of the obstacles that stand in the way so that the questioner can take a direct look at the cross of Jesus Christ. We put it simply, it is to help the thinker to believe and the believer to think. In short, we are in their arena, bringing the gospel of Christ to help them traverse the longest journey in life, the journey from the head to the heart. The fivefold thrust of RZIM has always been first and foremost evangelism. We do evangelism undergirded by apologetics. Apologetics is not the main course, it is the seasoning. The gospel is the main message. So we do evangelism, we do it with apologetics, understanding the questions of people. We are involved in training people where they are and within the church, and training our young to be able to answer the questions that are being asked of them. And then spiritual disciplines, because we never want to forget the heart that has to be touched and reached. So we've got evangelism, apologetics, training, and spiritual disciplines. But there is a fifth very important component. And to switch metaphors for just a moment, it was Francis Schaeffer who said evangelism has to walk on 2 feet. Evangelism is the proclamation, compassion and mercy ministries is the other foot with which you walk into arenas. So Wellspring International is the humanitarian arm of RZIM, which is apologetics with a touch. These 5 components of evangelism, apologetics, training, spiritual disciplines, and the humanitarian need. These are the issues that really carry us into various settings. RZIM historically has focused on 4 major groups: the academic, the business, the political, and the arts, because we believe these 4 arenas really shape the ethos and the values of a culture. Now, obviously, we get into many other groups. We do a lot of work in churches or groups and gatherings where people want to discuss such issues. But we think clearly that when you're in the academic arena or the business arena or the political arena or the arts, these ones so overtly affect culture that we want to be in those settings. You know, very recently I was being interviewed by a major magazine, and he said something that really, really encouraged me. He said, you know, when I think of your team and I think of the approach you all take, he said, your focus is on 2 major methods. Number 1, you focus on the beauty of the gospel and you respect the listener and the questioner. I said to him, you could not have encouraged my heart more in any question than just that, because that's what we really try to do as a team. You know, and the Bible says to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. The gospel is a beautiful story. It's a story not just told as fact, but it is told in the attractiveness of who Jesus Christ is and what his forgiveness and grace and transforming power mean. But you can never proclaim that without respecting the honest questioner and listening to them carefully. Have you noticed how Jesus engaged the woman at the well, for example, listening to her so carefully and systematically taking away those barriers that she had raised? And Peter reminds us
to set apart Christ in our hearts as Lord, and to always be prepared to give a reason, an apologia, an apologetic for the hope that is within you, and to do that with gentleness and respect, so we retain the dignity of the listener and never compromise on the nobility of the gospel. The barriers to belief are many, and they're actually increasing in intensity in our time. The intellectual barriers, think for example of the overt hostility of some of the most strident anti-theists of our time. Naturalism has become sort of the buzzword of interpreting everything from a single scientific vision. This is a challenge our universities face. They seem to be imparted to again and again that the naturalistic worldview, the scientific worldview has displaced the possibility of the miraculous. All spiritual talk is nothing but tooth fairy talk, according to Richard Dawkins. And so that barrier is very real. We cannot treat it as something minor. If a student is bombarded day in and day out with that framework and that paradigm, how then on a Sunday morning do they sit in church and want to listen to a story from the Gospels to be told as historic truth? So there's the intellectual barrier. There is the barrier of cultural values. So much is in transit. So much is changing that often anyone who claims exclusivity in truth is seen as prejudiced and marginalizing people in groups and so on. Those are issues that have to be engaged with. So there's the intellectual challenge, there's the ethical challenge, there are cultural challenges, there are breakdowns, or there's a breakdown of convictions once held. All of these stand as a block between the listener and the proclaimer. And let me add one more thing. If we don't reach our young generation now, we'll be in a recovery mode for years and years to come. We were warned in the 70s and 80s by people like Francis Schaeffer, Malcolm Muggeridge and others as to what was looming. The church did not take those warnings seriously, and we can see what exactly has happened. So we have to wrestle with the issues that keep people from putting their trust in the gospel narrative. The global reach is critical because the cross-cultural pollination that is going on. You know, they used to say the East is the East and the West is the West and the twain shall never meet. Couldn't be farther from the truth right now. I mean, on a given morning, you can have breakfast in New York and then end up having dinner in London. And you can have breakfast the next day in Delhi and on to Bangkok and Singapore. And I think somebody once told me that within 3 to 4 hours flight of Singapore, you can reach about 50% of the world's youth. You look at the high percentage of 40 to 50% in their teens and 20s and between India and China alone. An incredible wealth of youth that the world is now boasting that we need to reach. A global perspective is not only that for commercial purposes. You know, go into malls and you see all the same brands and same stuff that is floating all over the world. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the answer for every culture and every generation. We need to reach these various cultures. The two biggest challenges on naturalism is becoming pervasive, and then of course the worldview of Islam. How does one live in a time like this without understanding and responding to Islam, which is what RZIM is quite focused on as well. So the global family of humanity is really like what John Wesley would have said, the world is our parish.
The moral argument is one of the most fascinating argument, and for me, I think is the most compelling, because we exist in a universe that has do's and don'ts. It has rules of behavior. There are things we are supposed to do and things that we are not supposed to do.
Every human being has this sense that we are truly and really, in reality, obligated to avoid evil and to do good. Everybody has that sense of conscience. There's this real sense within every human being that there is an ought, there is a moral imperative that comes from somewhere. And it is universal, and so if it's universal, it's not just culturally shaped, even though some morality, certainly we would acknowledge, has some cultural factors in it. But this universal ought, this universal imperative, has to point to something bigger than humanity.
Morality or moral properties have a very interesting feature, and this is they are normative. They tell us how we are supposed to behave, what we're supposed to do, and what we are not supposed to do. And if that is the case, if they are normative, if we have moral duties, not just moral values, things that we have to do, it really does cry out, in my view, for a moral lawgiver, if we do have moral duties.
I can go back to my days before I was a Christian, and I lived a fairly wild life. Now, the idea that I didn't want God to exist was a very key issue in my life, because I didn't want something to impose upon me. But there was a sense at one level that laws as such were just the imposition of society. They were the imposition of parents or schools or authorities or the police. And only suckers believed that. And yet, when someone did something wrong to me, I was betrayed in a relationship very badly. And I was deeply angry. In fact, I wanted to go and beat the people up that were involved in this, because I wanted justice for the wrong that was done to me. So even in my non-believing state, that there was no God, there was no morality, there was a moral conscience, badly orientated, that I was following in some sense.
Another society may disagree with those very laws. What we say goes for our society might not go for other societies, and a much more recent contemporary example is, of course, what we saw in the Holocaust. We saw the most educated nation at its time come to a point where it was systematically exterminating those who they thought were weak. Now why? We have to ask the question why. If we jump straight to the idea that they were depraved monsters, we're missing out on key information here. The conclusion here was that if we are just meant to survive, if that's our whole purpose, then we ought to make ourselves as strong as a society as possible. So we're going to weed out the weak. It's our moral imperative to weed out the weak. There is no way we can conclude the Holocaust was wrong if we are cultural relativists, if we believe morals come from our own culture or society. But we know, as we showed in the Nuremberg trials, we know what they did was wrong, and we're willing to say that.
Let My People Think is a listener-supported television